Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Gardening Can Be Murder book presentation. My name is Raluca Barbu, and I am the Adult Programming Specialist at the Algonquin Area Library in Illinois. Joining us tonight is Marta McDowell, a writer, gardener, and avid mystery reader, as I assume most of you are. Martha's latest book, Gardening Can Be Murder, talks about the horticulture connections to crime fiction. She will explore the many ways in which writers have found inspiration in the sinister side of gardening. This program was made possible by the collaboration of the Northwestern Illinois Libraries. The book is available for checkout at some of the libraries in the area. The recording of this program will be available on the library's YouTube channel until December 1st. And since this is a Zoom webinar, your microphone and camera will be turned off as an attendee, but you can enable closed captioning and ask questions throughout using the chat or the Q&A feature. I will now turn it over to Marta. Marta, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I hope you will be okay in an hour with your, cold.
Yes, I apologize in advance to all of you who are clicking in because I have a bit of a cold, so my voice is a little gravelly. So we'll hope for the best. If I suddenly mute, it's because I need to cough. So thank you, Raluca, and again, thank you all for coming. And we'll just have a little look through the book and talk about sort of how it came to be and a few of my favorites that I uncovered, if you will, as I went along. So sometimes I think I was destined to be a writer. This is me, age 2. I know it's my second Christmas because this is our house in South Pasadena, California, which we left not long after that. I now live in New Jersey, which is where I spent most of my growing up years. But this was the Christmas present for the family that year, and the story goes that I would not leave the typewriter. I just kept saying, I type, which is kind of ironic because I spend a lot of my time, as I think of it, gardening at the keyboard now. So I was born into a family of readers, which was a great place to grow up. So we loved books. Everybody in the family did. And so, as you might guess, since my brother was the oldest, and he had probably the most robust bookshelf, he was 10 years older than me, I started with his Hardy Boys and read through as many of those as he had. The two in the middle were my two sisters, and I'll bet most of you can guess what I bridged to after that. And yes, indeed, that was Nancy Drew. So Nancy Drew, as I knew it, was in this kind of edition. These were not the first editions of many of these books. Nancy Drew's continued to be put out. But Nancy Drew had this kind of, I don't know, overreaching influence on my growing up years, I think. And sometimes I'm amazed that I didn't grow up with more of an inferiority complex, because Nancy Drew very deliberately, each book was about a different subject area. And regardless of the subject, Nancy excelled at it. So, it's like she did everything well. And so, of course, there was a gardening Nancy Drew that was called Password to Larkspur Lane. And you can see from the cover, there are the blue larkspur or delphinium. The book even talks about why they're called delphinium and the connection to the god Apollo and the oracle at Delphi, which, I thought, that's kind of amazing. I didn't remember that as a child. And you can see this kind of mysterious setup where there's a woman in a wheelchair and this very, elegant looking home up on the hill and a big fence. It looks like a prison. So in Password to Larkspur Lane, indeed, and you may know this edition, this was the first edition of The Password to Larkspur Lane as it was first titled. Still the same components, slightly different style in the hairdo. What's that, a Marcel type hairdo? The Password to Larkspur Lane came out in 1933. So, she grows larkspur and she picks them to put in a flower show. So here is Nancy with her flowers in the flower show. You will notice that her vase of flowers here got first prize, but here comes this very mysterious, kind of vicious looking, I guess that's a Doberman, coming in, knocking them over. And, there are all sorts of mysteries abound and clues. And, of course, she solves it by the end. So the real mystery of Nancy Drew is Carolyn Keene. And again, some of you may know Carolyn Keene is not a real person, never was. She is an invention of the publisher. The publisher was called Stratmeyer Syndicate. They were from Newark, New Jersey, and they came up with many series for young adults. Or for juvenile fiction, as it was called at the time. Now we would call it young adult fiction. So many different people have written as Carolyn Keene. I hope I didn't burst anyone's bubble. I had someone in an audience once sort of gasp in horror when I said that. But here is one of the people who wrote a lot of Nancy Drews. Her name was Mildred Wirt, later Mildred Wirt Benson. She went to the University of Iowa. That's where her archives are now. She did not actually write Password to Larkspur Lane, but she wrote many others, and you can see in many different series, including the Brownies. Here is the author, Carolyn Keene, for Password to Larkspur Lane. It was written by Walter Carrig. Walter Carrig was another very productive writer, probably better known for Victory at Sea than for writing as Carolyn Keene. But I love this picture of him with his typewriter and his little Siamese cat and the cigarette dangling out of his mouth. So there you go. As I grew older, and it wasn't long before I graduated to the library, it's the library I still go to today because I still live in the same town I've lived in since I was, just over 2 years old. The Library of the Chathams, I live in Chatham, New Jersey, has a very, very robust mystery section. There were mysteries in the children's room, and then I graduated to the adult section. And libraries have a very important role in this particular book because I wrote this book during lockdown. This was one of the ways that I stayed sane. And the librarians really deserve a medal because even during lockdown, they were going in on shifts and getting us books throughout our local library system and putting them in little brown paper bags and leaving them in the back hallway for us to all come in and get all masked up. So, hooray for the librarians. I want to say a word about the illustrations in my book because you're going to see quite a number of them. And this was a really fun collaboration, again, all done during lockdown with a friend of mine named Yolanda Fundora. Yolanda is a quilt designer and a fabric designer. So those colorful things that you see behind her, if you're not a quilter, you may not recognize a stash when you see it, but that is her fabric stash or a part of it. So I think I actually called Yolanda on the phone and said, do you have time and interest in doing some illustrations for this book? And she said, well, what do you have in mind? Give me some ideas that I can work with. And I said, well, I always liked Edward Gorey In particular, his illustrations that are animated at the beginning of Masterpiece Mystery. So if you've ever watched the old Mystery or the new Masterpiece Mystery, you will recognize those little characters. He was a very prolific, very unusual artist. He did a lot of theater work. He did sets for Dracula and things like that. So Edward Gorey. Then I also said, well, I kind of like silhouettes. And also, when I was a kid, I loved this magazine called Highlights for Children. Now, my parents were very thrifty. We did not subscribe to Highlights for Children, but it did make things like going to the dentist or going to the doctor's office a little bit more entertaining. And for me, I was particularly looking for a feature that was in every issue, and it was a find the hidden objects. So they would have this black and white illustration, kind of elaborate. And if you look carefully, for example, if you look at the tree on the left-hand side and you go up the trunk, you'll see there's a fish. And if you keep going up, oh, you'll see there's an arm. So, and then they would give you the list of things that you had to find. So I gave her those ideas. A day or two later, she emails me a sample. She goes, well, what do you think about this? And I go, oh, you got it. This is exactly what I had in mind, this kind of feeling. So she said, well, give me a list of all the topic areas that you want, and I'll get to work. So you'll see a good sampling of Yolanda's really fabulous illustrations. They all had to be black and white because the publisher said, that's all we get. So here's one, Gardening Detectives. When I wrote this book, it was a little different than most of the books I've written. So generally I write about a person like Beatrix Potter or Emily Dickinson and their gardening or plant interests. And so there's a kind of natural arc, there's a natural structure because you're talking about a person's life. This, I was talking about many, many different authors and many different books. So the skeleton, if you'll pardon the, the sort of pun that I used, the framework was to say, okay, what are the elements of a sort of classic murder mystery, and to organize it that way. So I started out with Gardening Detectives. Now, Edgar Allan Poe is credited with the invention or the prototype for the detective, the modern detective story. There's Yolanda's illustration of Poe. And that was with a 1841 long short story called Murders in the Rue Morgue. Now, you may be able to make it out. He initially called it Murders in the Rue Trianon, which doesn't sound nearly as good as Murders in the Rue Morgue. So I'm glad he made that editorial change. It is not actually about gardening, even though the Botanical Garden of Paris, the Jardin des Plantes, does make a decided appearance in it. It's really not about plants. It's about something else, and I don't want to spoil it if you haven't read it. The first gardening detective that I came across was in The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. The Moonstone is, it's not a murder mystery, but it's definitely a mystery. It's sort of a Gothic mystery, and it's about particularly a jewel called the Moonstone. And it gets stolen. A detective from Scotland Yard is called in. His name is Sergeant Cuff. And there's Sergeant Cuff in an illustration from an early edition of the book. And you'll see he's standing in a rose garden because he absolutely loves roses. He's quoted as saying, one of these days, please God, I shall retire from catching thieves and try my hand at growing roses. And indeed, roses are sort of intertwined in the whole book. And we get to see Sergeant Cuff in his retirement and then coming out of retirement as well, but all somewhat related to roses. And then one of my favorite gardening detectives if we were all together. Yes.
Epiphyllum philanthus. In the Morgan
Oops.
Library's collection, one finds a lyrical watercolor by
Sorry, hang
Edgar
on.
with the title Leaves
I am
and
just
Flowers of
going
the
to
Orchid Cactus.
mute. There we go. Sorry about that. Something in the background was running on my computer. My apologies. So back to one of my favorite gardening detectives, and that is Miss Marple. So Miss Marple was the creation, of course, of Agatha Christie. She was one of Christie's favorite characters. So Jane Marple and Hercule Poirot are the ones that get the most print from Agatha Christie's very productive hand. Miss Marple is introduced very early on, and then Christie goes on to write about her for decades. The problem was she had introduced Miss Marple as a woman of a certain age. And she once said, you know, I should have made Jane Marple a schoolgirl when I introduced her, because if you're going to write about somebody for, you know, 3 or 4 decades, then you've got to, you know, you've got to suspend disbelief, if you will, that they're still alive. So many actors have played Miss Marple in television and film. I was actually surprised about Angela Lansbury when I started, you know, sort of, you know, putting this together, but she was not just in Murder, She Wrote. She was also in a Miss Marple movie or two. Jane Marple was a gardener. She was in a village called St. Mary Mead. She had a flower garden that she very much loved. She did not grow vegetables, but she did grow the occasional herb, such as tansy, for her grandmother's tansy tea recipe. But she thought that gardening and bird watching were great hobbies if you were going to be a sleuth, because you could be outside and be watching what people were up to. Now, if I visited Miss Marple, I would try to go in the afternoon, you know, when the sun hits a certain place, and hope that she might offer me some of her damson gin. So gin made from plums. I read all of the Marple short stories and novels. There are loads of them, but I eventually ran out, and I did have this feeling I was really bereft. And so if you feel like you'd like more Miss Marple, I have good news, and that is that there is a new book. So when I was working on this, this ad popped up. You know, when you do too many searches, you start to get ads that are related to it. And this ad popped up for a book, and it said Agatha Christie Marple 12 New Mysteries. And I was so excited. I thought, you know, oh, they've found more. You know, they opened up some trunk. But if you read the fine print, you'll notice that there are 12 new mysteries by 12 contemporary crime fiction writers, and actually all very good. Quite a number of the stories are about horticulture and gardening. So that was really fun. And I'm sure your library has that as well. Okay, speaking of gardening detectives, we have Brother Cadfael. Brother Cadfael was the protagonist in a series of 21 books by a woman named Edith Pargeter, writing under the pen name Ellis Peters. It's a very interesting sort of place in the history of the mystery, because these were written in the 1970s and 80s, and she really, again, created a prototype for the historical murder mystery, which is extremely popular still today. You can also see she must have written fast, because she wrote 21 books in, what, 11 years. So that is really quick. It takes me about 3 years to write a book. So good for her. I remember Derek Jacobi playing Brother Cadfael in the old masterpiece mystery series. You can probably, again, still get these from the library, and they're well worth watching. They're set in the 11th century in an actual abbey, that historically existed. And some of the stories, like the first one, A Morbid Taste for Bones, it's about relocating the bones of a saint. This actually happened. This is in the Chronicles. And so she makes a mystery story out of it. And they're very well researched. She lived in Shrewsbury, or as they pronounce it, Shrewsbury, where this Benedictine abbey was up until the time, of course, of Henry VIII, when all the abbeys went away. So that's Cadfael. Again, really fun reads. Okay, so that was a couple of gardening detectives. I'll only just give you a couple of examples of each. Then we have Scene of the Crime. And again, you see Yolanda's illustration. I want to point out, I hope everyone sees the little toe in the fountain there. So there have been mysteries written about actual gardens. So this is a famous garden in the south of England called Sissinghurst. Sissinghurst was designed by Vita Sackville West and her husband Harold Nicholson. It's from the early 20th century. Again, very famous. It's in the remains of an old castle. It's quite beautiful, and especially famous for the garden. If you look at that circle that's called a rondelle, next to it is an area with a lot of gray and white plants. That's the White Garden. Stephanie Barron, who's written another series about Jane Austen murder mysteries, wrote this mystery about Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. So it's called The White Garden. Both Virginia and Vita are in the book, along with many of their Bloomsbury Circle. And then it's also one of those books that is in the present and in the past. And you'll see this is Virginia Woolf's profile outlined in plants here. So again, a very good read, particularly if you like a literary kind of novel, which I do. Then this garden, which I have never been to and would love to go to someday, is called Ilnacolin. It is an Italianate garden off the coast of Ireland, but just off on a little island in Bantry Bay near Cork. It appears in description only, but a very clear, vivid description in an Agatha Christie novel called Halloween Party, very appropriate for this time of year. So it's an Hercule Poirot story. And in it, he describes this Irish garden on an island and what does it look like. And it was such a good description that I could actually figure out what the garden was just from the text in the book. And it turns out that Agatha Christie had visited this garden just before she wrote Halloween Party. So it was input to that. And there's also another garden that is really important to the story, that is a rock garden. So that was really fun. It was the basis for the latest Kenneth Branagh film where he plays Hercule Poirot, called A Haunting in Venice. But it is only vaguely based on Halloween Party. It's completely reset. There is a little garden element in it, but you really have to look carefully to see the connections. And then Deacon King Kong was one of my favorite finds for this book. Again, it's not a classic murder mystery, but there is a shooting from the start, and there is an Irish police officer, and they're trying to figure out what happened, and there are gangsters and all sorts of characters. James McBride, his most recent book is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, but he's great at writing characters, and this just has such a wonderful cast of characters, including a couple of gardeners. So there's gardening in this, there's foraging in this, And there is a very special plant. I don't know if any of you grow this. Mine is out of bloom now, but just out of bloom. It is called moonflower. Moonflower is like the nighttime equivalent or the evening equivalent of the morning glory. And it appears very prominently in Deacon King Kong. It's really easy to grow if you've never grown it. I grow it from seed every year that I just plant directly in the ground. I stick a couple pieces of bamboo in the ground and it climbs up, and it opens about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and then stays open all evening, probably all night, but by the morning it's closed up. It's a moth pollinated plant, so it's white and fragrant at night. So, motive. Can gardening make you want to kill someone? Absolutely. Can be very frustrating, even though it can be very rewarding too. I love the title. If I never read the book, I'd love the book just for the title, called Deadheads. But it's a fabulous read. It's all about rose gardening from the opening chapter all the way to the end. And it's about an obsession with a rose garden. So roses go all the way through this. In fact, each chapter is named for a different variety of rose that has something to do with the action in the chapter. So I recommend that one. Again, if you'd rather have your murder mysteries via some kind of video streaming, you can stream the old DL and Pasco series. It is one of the episodes in season 2, which you can get on PBS Passport or I'll bet from your library system. And then Turn of the Key has a marvelous garden as a main sort of element and also setting. It has a poison garden in it. And again, Ruth Ware, writes a really good thriller, but do not read this as bedtime reading, because I think I was up till like 3 in the morning one night, or one early morning, trying to finish this book. And it surprised me at the end, which all of her books always do, but they're really that kind of gripping, edge of the seat kind of read. I actually wrote Ruth Ware and asked her if this was based on a book or inspired by a short story novella by Nathaniel Hawthorne called Rappaccini's Daughter, which has a poison garden. And she said, no, it was actually inspired by Henry James' Turn of the Screw. So, oh well, another good theory shot to heck. But she said she thought that the plant and poison connection was an interesting one. And I tried very hard to find a noir mystery. The noir is this hard-boiled detective fiction that was popular, I guess, 20s, 30s, 40s. And I thought, oh, no orchids for Miss Blandish. But the joke was there are no orchids. I read the whole book. There are no orchids for Miss Blandish other than on the cover and title page. Is just sort of symbolic, like Black Dahlia. And the only one I could find that really worked was a scene out of The Big Sleep, which is a Raymond Chandler novel from 1939, the Humphrey Bogart film from 1946, where he's in the Sternwood mansion and he goes into the glass house to meet with the general. And there's this wonderful description of these really sinister orchids. So that was really the best I could do. All right, then we've got, how do you kill someone with something related to the garden? Well, there are a lot of sharp tools, as you can see from Yolanda's illustration. And from a Christmas present that my husband gave me one year, this is called a Japanese soil knife. I opened it up and was kind of shocked because it really looked lethal. Now mine is all like dented up because I use it on my very rocky soil, but it is quite a potent weapon, as many things are in the garden shed, including, it turns out, perhaps a bag of mulch. Well, not exactly, but this was the book that kind of started my whole journey down this garden path, if you will. It's called Mulch. I don't think Anne Ripley is with us any longer, but Anne Ripley was a garden writer. She made her protagonist a garden writer. And in the book, the protagonist moves to a new suburb. She decides she wants to mulch with fallen leaves. She doesn't have enough on her property. It's the fall, so she goes around and collects other people's bags of leaves from various neighborhoods in the area. Well, it turns out that one of the bags has body parts in it. So, this is a little bit gruesome, but there's a lot about plants and gardening in this story because, again, the protagonist is a garden writer. So that was the thing that sort of turned on the light bulb for me. And I said, oh, maybe there's at least an article, which I first wrote, and a book in this. Weed Killer, of course, gets a lot of play in various murder mysteries. It's been used by Dorothy L. Sayers, and certainly Agatha Christie. More recently, MC Beaton in one of the Agatha Raisin mysteries called The Potted Gardener, where this is also the murder weapon. There again, if you want to watch the series, there's a Agatha Raisin episode called The Potted Gardener, where you get the gist of the story at any rate. But they're a lot of fun, particularly if you need a break from, edge of your seat thrillers or something that's a little too gruesome. And then, of course, we can't talk about gardening and murder mysteries without talking a little bit about poison plants. Many plants are poison. Even this sort of pencil plant behind me is mildly toxic. I don't think you die from it, but you could certainly make yourself uncomfortable if you started chewing on it. And many of the things that I grow show up in murder mysteries. So I was sort of like amused in a way when I started looking around my garden to see how many are somewhat toxic or at least potent. So foxglove, this has been used for really centuries for heart medication, but in enough quantity, it is toxic. And if you want to learn how to actually sort of extract digitalin, the poison part, from garden foxglove, you can read an Alan Bradley novel called The Weed That Strings the Hangman's Bag. This is the second in the series starring Flavia DeLuce, who starts out as an 11-year-old chemistry buff. So they're quite fun to read. And, it's a fun, long series. Alan Bradley is a Canadian author. And there are foxglove in my garden. I thought I'd show you some of my garden pictures. Then we have castor bean. This is not a very good picture of this cover for Murder on Embassy Row, but Margaret Truman, so Harry and Bess Truman's daughter, wrote a series of capital crimes mysteries with some help. She had some assistance from another writer. And in Murder on Embassy Row, castor bean is used, again, as a murder weapon. It's very toxic. In fact, you may remember there was I think a Bulgarian journalist in London who was killed by a poison-tipped umbrella that was poisoned from castor bean or ricin, ricinus. And then we have clues, right? You can't have a good mystery story without having clues to follow. So what clues can come out of plants? Well, some clues can be related to roses. This is a particular rose called Zephyrine Drouhin. I love this rose. I grow it. It is very fragrant. It only blooms once a year, so it blooms, end of May into June for me. And it's my favorite rose to prune. Some of you probably know why, because it has no thorns. This appears in Hercule Poirot's story. I'm not going to tell you which one because that would give it away. So I'll just, oops, yes, I will. Ooh, I put that in. Sad Cypress. So you'll have to forget about that if you decide to read it because it's an important little clue at the end. Speaking of thorns, here are some very thorny seeds. These are the seeds of caltrop, also called puncture vine. They have the scientific name Tribulus terrestris. It sounds like a dinosaur to me, but look at them. I mean, these are on the bottom of someone's hiking boots, and you can see these seed pods really stuck in there with these really sharp thorns. Caltrop is a clue in Tony Hillerman's The Wailing Wind. Again, this is another one that has been put on video that you can stream, and it was a clue that's used for placing where the crime was actually committed versus where the body was found. So I thought it was very clever. He winds it into Navajo ethnobotany, which is also really interesting. And for me, because I love to research, I had to figure out what is this word caltrop, which I had never heard before. It turns out caltrop is an ancient weapon. The Roman armies used it. They made all of these little, I guess they, the smiths would make all these little metal sharp pegs and they'd throw them out in front of oncoming armies to damage the feet and hooves, which is another sort of gruesome thing. But that's where the name comes from. And then, can gardeners be the suspects? Absolutely. So they appear as suspects in many different books. This one I particularly loved the writing. I just came across this, frankly, because of the name, Death in the Garden. But a body is discovered in this English garden, and the owner and gardener is a suspect sort of all the way through. And it's, again, one of these kind of flashback novels, quite interesting. Elizabeth Ironside is an Oxford educated writer. It turns out that her name is actually Lady Catherine Manning. She was, when this book was introduced, the wife of the British ambassador to the United States, which had to be a great place for a book launch at the British Embassy. But it's a really good read. Okay, and I'll just close with one of my favorite things to look at, which is the relationship between writers and gardeners. So I looked at several and I interviewed several contemporary writers, so those were all fun. So here's Agatha Christie with her many, many books. Agatha Christie grew up in a country home. There was a garden there. Her grandmother had a big rose garden. And when she was married to her second husband, they purchased a home called Greenway in the south of Devon, which is out sort of in the west country of England, very near to where she grew up. And it had a really lovely collection of rhododendrons and camellias, which they added to. So she got to be quite the gardener toward the end of her life. I'd love to go there someday. It is a National Trust property now, so you can go visit. I'm sure they have a great gift shop and tea room. But if you don't have a chance to go to England, you can see shots of Greenway, so Agatha Christie's country home, in the very last Hercule Poirot mystery that starred David Suchet. And so it's set at Greenway. You can see the portico there. And so it's got some nice shots of the garden. Dead Man's Folly. Rex Stout, another really interesting character. He was brilliant in a lot of ways and had a very interesting career, including at one point he was in the Navy and he served on Theodore Roosevelt's yacht, which I thought was just great. But he wrote a huge series starring Nero Wolfe, who was this sort of corpulent detective. And Nero Wolfe loved orchids. Excuse me, I'll get some water. So there's Nero. Again, a lot of different people played Nero Wolfe. And his sidekick, Archie Goodwin, including William Shatner, who I think of as Captain Kirk, played in a pilot as Archie Goodwin. Rex Stout had a huge plant collection, both inside and out. And but not many orchids, a few, but that was pretty funny because something like 400 different orchid varieties are named in the Nero Wolfe canon. But he actually had a great preference for tall bearded irises. You can see a picture here of his collection in Danbury, Connecticut. So a great gardener and a really prolific writer. And I will close because I'm losing my voice with Cynthia Riggs, another very interesting writer and gardener. She started writing when she was in her 60s, still going strong. She's hoping to come out with 20 different mysteries starring a 90-year-old detective based on her mother. And she is a 16th generation Martha's Vineyarder. And that's the old family homestead. So with that, I will just close with a few little tidbits. My favorite New Yorker cartoon. And be careful how many mysteries you read or your garden may end up looking like mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. Wait, can you answer this one question from Pamela?
Of course.
Yeah,
Yes, Pamela, I have read Anthony Eglin. I'm trying to think of which one. It's I can't think of the title of it. I mentioned it in my book, but it's just not coming to me. It's about a Gertrude Jekyll garden, a fictional one, but it's a lot of fun. And he was quite the rosarian as well.
Okay, Martha, thank you so much for this presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And, you know, now they probably have a long list of books to read. So
Thank you very much.
I bet they're thankful. So take care and we wish you good health. Okay.
Yep. Happy
Good night.
Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody.